51 more, 15 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Ahearne. You're very welcome. In November 2008, the Irish Times called you the economist who told you so. And that area of your work is very important, and I want to go into that today. But another area of your work that's also very important was when you were working for Brian Lenihan as an advisor. And you wrote about that in a book, in a recent book that was published, a chapter in that book. And I was hoping, if I may, with your agreement, to get some facts on the record in relation to that period of time, facts that could help us better prepare for the next stage of the inquiry in mapping out the work that we would like to do.
My invitation to come here was to discuss early warnings, contrarian views, and that's what I've prepared in my statement. So to be honest with you, I haven't prepared for, I would have to look up my records if we're dealing with some other issues. I mean, this is the context phase, and I was invited in that context. I know that you're having you're moving on to the nexus phase where you deal with subsequent issues. I'd be delighted to come back if I'm invited and to discuss those issues. So I'm happy to deal with sort of the issues when I was working for Brian Lenihan and those sorts of issues. I'm happy to do that. But I think I will, in fairness, in order to give accurate answers, if you're going to ask me about some of the details, I really would need to have a look back at my record.
What I had hoped to do was just to go through the chapter in the book and clarify certain facts. But if you'd like to wait until the nexus phase.
I think, again, I want to give the committee accurate answers, so I think I prefer to try to have some time to prepare for that.
Do you mind if I ask you questions then prior to when you were working for the Minister?
Brilliant.
And coming up and looking around, in particular, I want to begin with the pre-guarantee period and around those few months around the guarantee, because you did have a meeting with Minister Lenihan in August, just prior to the guarantee being announced.
That's right.
Where did that meeting take place?
In his office in the department.
And who initiated that meeting, or how was it arranged?
It must have come at his initiative. I got an invitation to come up to the office.
Okay. And was it a meeting between the two of you, or was there a group discussion?
There were several people in the room sort of coming and going, but it was mostly the Minister and myself.
How long did the meeting last?
I'd say over an hour, maybe an hour and a half.
And what was the purpose of the meeting?
We had a very wide-ranging discussion about lots of different things that were going on in the Irish economy.
And, I mean, did you find it odd that you've been invited to have a meeting with the Minister at that stage?
Not really. Not particularly. You know, I mean, I had written a lot of stuff and had been vocal in the media, so I didn't find it. It struck me as a sensible thing for a minister to reach out. I mean, I've subsequently learned that he was actually meeting a lot of people around that time, a lot of different economists. That was his style. He spoke to an awful lot of people and bounced ideas off a lot of people. So no, it wasn't. I don't find it odd.
Your impression at the time during that meeting, do you think that the Minister had an accurate picture at that point as to what was happening in the banking system?
I was a little concerned that he might not have had. We had a discussion about the banking system. I remember him. I talked to him a lot about the international experience and stuff that had happened. So I wasn't there sort of giving him advice. I was just giving him my experience and the stuff talking about the stuff that I had known. I did say to him that it'd be important that you have a very accurate picture of what these banks are like, what their loan books really look like. Now, I wasn't assuming that he didn't have that, but I did, and he said, "Thank you, that's very good advice."
I think, if I'm correct, you raised, or you spoke in particular about Anglo and IMBS, about their prospects. Do you recall if you raised those two banks, or if the Minister raised those two banks?
I don't recall.
Okay. And was the issue of bank failure discussed, potential bank failure?
No, we didn't use those terms, but I mean, we were talking about the property market, and I guess we may have got onto Anglo and Irish Nationwide because those were the two most exposed to the property market. And I must say I didn't know much about Irish Nationwide, and I was surprised. I remember him saying this bank is extremely exposed, or something along those lines, and that was news to me. I knew very little about that bank. I had known just from anecdotally that Anglo was very exposed. So we discussed. I was a little. I remember just on that discussion, he seemed to have little. I mean, he mentioned that yes, Anglo very troubled, highly exposed, and therefore troubled, but it also has some good stuff. He said something like that, which was sort of surprised me because everything I was sort of hearing, all the rumours at the time it was a complete basket case. But he mentioned that. Now whether he was referring to that they had some properties in New York or London or maybe some stuff in Dublin that probably he may well have been talking about that. He seemed to he didn't have any such comments about nationwide. He seemed to think that they were even worse.
Even worse. And was nationalisation or a guarantee mentioned at all?
No, there was no discussion of solutions or what was going to happen.
Okay. We move into September, and on September the 14th, you had an article in the Sunday Independent, and you were talking about the banks, and you said the information they have been releasing about the quality of their loan books does not always square with anecdotes about potentially huge losses associated with land purchases and unsold developments. I mean, to what extent then did you understand the threat posed to the financial system by the problems in the banks?
I mean, I had known that from my own experience and research that when you get a big property crash, that is always damaging to banks. There have been times, as I wrote about, where it has brought down the whole banking system, for example, put the whole banking system or large parts of it into insolvency, for example, in Scandinavia. There have been times the banking system, although the property market has crashed, the banking system has got through that without that much damage. Hong Kong is an example, which I covered that economy at the Fed. They had a 50% decline, peak to trough in property prices, a really bad crash in the property market, but it did not burst the banks. The banks more or less sailed through that. So I didn't have information to make predictions about what the crash in the property market was going to do to the banks. It depended on lots of factors.
You took the anecdotes seriously enough so that you questioned what information was being released by the banks.
Yeah, that's right. Because again, I'd been hearing, and they were just that. They were anecdotes and sort of rumours you'd hear socially. I had always tried to base my commentary on evidence and facts. Maybe occasionally I did write commentary sort of when I talked about anecdotes. But what I've been hearing is that the property market had really stalled back in mid-2006 into 2007. And if you look at the price index, it wasn't falling, but there were very few houses being transacted. So developers had finished projects. They might have been able to sell a couple of houses at their asking price. That meant that the index didn't fall. It looks like the prices weren't falling, but they weren't selling. They were selling very few, and that had meant that these developers weren't able to pay back their loans. I mean, what would happen? They're getting money. They sell off. They're getting loans. They sell off all these properties. They then use the money from the properties to pay off their loans. But they must have been stuck at that stage. So what I was hearing was that the banks, some of the banks, may have been rolling over these loans. In order, what they do is they're not getting repaid by the developer. Now there's a problem. But rather than the developer actually formally defaulting, they were making a new loan to the developer. The developer would use the money from the new loan to pay back the old one, and that would make the developer would therefore not be in default. So it would look on the bank's books that the loans are fine, but there's a big problem because the developer isn't selling the properties. And that's the sort of rumour I picked up on. And that sort of worried me. It reminded me a bit of the Japanese experience where the banks kept rolling over the property developers even though they were de facto bust. And that just worried me a little bit.
Any indications at the time about risks of insolvency in the banks from what the information you had?
I mean, I had very little. I was writing these articles from an office in Galway, so I had no details other than the experience that there had been in previous property crashes. Banking systems had gone bust in some cases. In other cases, they hadn't.
You met the minister again at the Fianna Fáil Parliamentary Party think-in on the 15th of September, and you wrote that in 2008. You wrote that he mused whether it would be possible to knock over 2 dominoes without knocking the other 4. That was his expression.
Yes.
Dominoes, yeah. And you assumed he was contemplating the closure of Anglo and IMBS, but was concerned about the knock-on effects. Okay. And why do you think he was contemplating this at that time?
I don't know. I mean, it may have been related to the earlier discussion about exposures. I think both those institutions were heavily exposed to the property market. The other banks had more diversified loan portfolios. They had mortgages and they had other types of corporate loans. But Anglo was a monoline merchant bank that all it did was property. I hadn't realised that Irish Nationwide in many ways was like that too. So I think there was must have been some it probably reflected those facts.
I think he said that you got the impression he was exploring a wide range of alternatives. Did he mention any other alternatives to you in that meeting or in that discussion?
No.
Okay.
In fact, he didn't. Even in that in Galway, he didn't discuss guarantees. It was a little cryptic in that I wasn't. He didn't mention banks at all. Talking with dominoes, so he was trying to be. I wasn't an advisor, so he couldn't give me too much information.
Do you have a sense that his thinking might have changed at all from your previous meeting in August?
Not particularly. I mean, it was a bit more developed. He hadn't mentioned dominoes in the previous, so it looks like it was evolving and it was developing. But in neither of those meetings did he say, "Here's what we plan to do." It wasn't like that.
And did you speak again before the guarantee was brought in?
No.
And did you speak immediately in the period after it? Okay. You did respond to the guarantee decision with an article in the Irish Times on October the 1st, 2008. If you could, your reaction to the guarantee at the time is well documented in that article. Other academics were having a different reaction. Your position now on whether the guarantee was a well-designed policy versus at the time?
To be honest, I have an open mind on it. I'm like yourselves. I'm watching, listening to all the witnesses, and I think I'd rather wait until all the witnesses come in and gathered all the information before I'd make a decision. It's complicated. I said at the time that it was important not to let the banks go into a disorderly failure. It was important that the next morning people didn't walk into an Irish bank to withdraw money and be told, "Sorry, the bank has no money." That would have been chaotic. That's a disorderly failure. So the government was absolutely right to make sure that didn't happen. I did mention how important it was to safeguard deposits. I'd written a few weeks earlier that there was some panic around it, and there was radio shows, people withdrawing the money, and I had written a piece saying that people should not panic about deposit. Deposit will be safe. The government, I'm sure, will do everything to protect deposits. But I did raise the issue of subordinated debt in that article. I was puzzled by why they included subordinated debt. Now, that doesn't mean there wasn't a good reason. I couldn't think of a good reason, but that might be my problem. But I did say it probably proved controversial.
You subsequently didn't discover the reason for why subordinated debt was included?
I did not.
Okay. You have written that, or you were talking about the European finance ministers. They announced a coordinated response on the 7th of October. But you say undoubtedly Brussels and Frankfurt had sent a clear message to capital weeks earlier that there'd be no repeat of Lehman's debacle in Europe.
Yes.
Would you like to expand on that? This clear message that was undoubtedly sent?
There would have been a lot of work done in the European committees, I'm sure in August and right through September as the global financial crisis was getting more and more intense. They must have been discussing these. And I think they would have, maybe not formally, they would have come to an informal agreement. But here's the way we're going to handle this crisis. And in particular, we're not going to have a Lehman Brothers in Europe. So after Lehman's collapse and the chaos that spread, I'm pretty sure that at the committee level and therefore transmitted through the committee level back to the capitals, there would have been a message sent, we're not going to have a Lehman's in Europe. No disorderly bank failures.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. And final question then. You've been critical of Ollie Rehn for saying that the blanket guarantee was a mistake. Is that a fair assessment? Sorry, have you criticised Ollie Rehn for his view?
I wasn't critical, but I said it was puzzling that what he said was he said it was a mistake, but the European Commission, the guarantee had to go to the European Commission for approval, legislative approval, and they approved it. But if you look at the legislation, they can only approve an intervention like that under certain conditions. I can't remember the exact terms you may have in front of you. If the intervention is appropriate, proportionate, something like that. They have certain terms. So they clearly deemed the guarantee to be an appropriate response, proportional, not an excessive response. So if they deem that to be the case in improving the guarantee, how could it then be a mistake? That puzzled me. And I said maybe that might get clarified at some stage.
Okay, thank you.